Isabella Ashford was the devoted wife, Juliet Vaughan, the seductive outsider, and Charles Ashford, the billionaire who thought he could have it all, until his betrayal set off a scandal so explosive it shattered lives, destroyed fortunes, and left him with nothing but regret. Charles Ashford was a man born into wealth, but determined to multiply it. By the age of 42, he had built one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast. Towering skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and sprawling developments bore his name in gold-plated lettering. He graced magazine covers, gave keynote speeches at elite conferences, and dined with senators and CEOs. To the outside world, he was the embodiment of the American dream, wealthy, powerful, and endlessly successful. But beyond the billion-dollar deals and photo ops, there was another part of his life, just as carefully cultivated: his marriage to Isabella. Isabella Ashford, formerly Isabella Clarke, came from a modest but well-educated family. A graduate of Columbia University with a background in art history and nonprofit work, she had always drawn people in with her quiet intelligence and understated grace. When she met Charles at a fundraiser gala 12 years earlier, she wasn't impressed by the luxury car he arrived in or the Rolex on his wrist. What caught her attention was his focus on building community centers in low-income neighborhoods, something her foundation also championed. For Charles, it was strategic philanthropy. For Isabella, it was genuine passion. Somehow, their worlds aligned. Their relationship quickly became the envy of New York society. They were photographed at every major event, praised for their seemingly balanced blend of business and benevolence. Charles made speeches about loyalty and legacy, always crediting Isabella as his moral compass. She in turn remained composed, in the spotlight, supporting his ventures and running her own charitable foundation quietly, but effectively. After a few years of marriage, they decided to start a family, a journey more complicated than either of them expected. Isabella faced multiple miscarriages, a deeply painful and private struggle that took a toll on both her body and spirit. Charles, busy expanding his empire, offered support in the only way he knew how, by hiring the best doctors and giving her space to grieve in private. Their attempts at communication grew strained. Charles buried himself in work. Isabella turned to therapy and her foundation. But they didn't give up. After 7 years of trying, Isabella finally became pregnant. The news brought a brief, golden period of unity. Charles took time off to attend appointments. They decorated the nursery together. For once, they seemed like a real family in the by-making, but something changed in Charles around the 5th month of Isabella's pregnancy. He became distant again. His texts turned shorter. His trips grew longer. He blamed work, of course, and Isabella, eager not to disrupt the fragile peace they'd found, accepted it. Still, there was a quiet unease growing in her mind. Sometimes, he would return home late, smelling faintly of a woman's perfume. He brushed it off as hotel lobby air or an elevator ride with a colleague. Isabella wanted to believe him. She had too much at stake not to. Charles, however, was already slipping into a dangerous game. During one of his business trips to Miami, he had met Juliet Vaughan at a luxury yacht party hosted by one of his investors. Juliet was striking, tall, blonde, and captivating in a way that felt almost theatrical. She wasn't shy about her ambitions. She introduced herself as an event planner for high-end clients, but made it clear she was looking for more than just a paycheck. She was drawn to power, and Charles exuded it. He was flattered by the attention. It had been a long time since anyone looked at him without associating him with responsibilities, commitments, or expectations. What began as harmless flirtation became something far more serious within weeks. Juliet knew exactly what she was doing. She didn't ask about Isabella. She didn't mention the pregnancy. She simply became the escape Charles didn't know he was looking for. They started meeting in hotel rooms under false names. She traveled with him on business to London, to Dubai, to Los Angeles. Charles began making excuses to leave home more frequently. Juliet knew how to stroke his ego, something Isabella, with her quiet strength and growing belly, no longer did. Isabella began noticing changes she couldn't ignore. Credit card bills included charges for women's jewelry she didn't own. His personal assistant, once friendly and chatty, became guarded. Charles started sleeping in the guest room under the pretense of not disturbing her while she rested. He stopped asking about the baby. One night, while he was supposedly on a trip to Chicago, Isabella opened his laptop to find a hotel confirmation in Paris. There was no conference scheduled there, no meetings, just a luxury suite for two and a dinner reservation for Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn. She didn't confront him. Instead, she began documenting everything. She copied emails, took photos of receipts, and quietly downloaded his call logs. She didn't know what she would do with the information yet, but something inside her shifted that night. The betrayal hurt deeply, not just because of the affair, but because of the timing. She was 7 months pregnant, more vulnerable than ever, and he had left her emotionally and physically alone. Isabella began spending more time at her lawyer's office. She learned how assets were split in high-net-worth divorces. She asked questions about offshore accounts, shell companies, and financial discovery. Her lawyer, a seasoned professional in high-stakes litigation, was cautious but impressed by her clarity. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply said she wanted to be prepared. Meanwhile, Charles believed he was in control. With Juliet at his side, he started imagining a different life, one without the responsibilities of fatherhood or the expectations of a long marriage. Juliet encouraged these thoughts, planting ideas about freedom, reinvention, and starting over. She told him he was still young, that he didn't need to be tied down, and Charles, flattered and deluded, began to believe her. 3 weeks before Isabella's due date, Charles filed for divorce. The papers arrived via courier on a rainy Tuesday morning. No warning, no conversation. Just cold legal documents ending a decade-long marriage. Isabella, sitting alone in the nursery she had decorated by hand, read the papers without emotion. She expected it. What Charles didn't expect was what would come next. Juliet Vaughn had never been one to play by the rules. From a young age, she had learned that charm could open more doors than credentials, and ambition could be more powerful than wealth itself. Born in a small town in Oregon, she'd left home at 18 with little more than a suitcase and a dream. After years of hustling through hostess jobs, high-end social events, and connections with wealthy clients, she found her niche as a luxury event planner. It was a job that gave her access to the elite, people with money, influence, and egos ripe for manipulation. But Juliet didn't just want to organize parties for the rich. She wanted to become one of them. Meeting Charles Ashford was no accident. At a yacht party in Miami, hosted by one of her former clients, she had made sure to be introduced to him. She'd done her research. She knew who he was, the billionaire with a real estate empire and a picture-perfect wife. What she saw wasn't a happily married man. She saw an opportunity. Charles arrived alone that night, sipping champagne on the upper deck. eyes scanning the crowd not for deals, but for distraction. Juliet made her move. With just the right balance of mystery and flirtation, she introduced herself, asked no questions about his business or family, and made him laugh. By the end of the night, they had exchanged numbers. Within a week, they were having dinner in New York. Charles was captivated. Juliet offered something Isabella didn't: novelty. She didn't talk about pregnancy, nursery themes, or baby names. She didn't ask about board meetings or foundation galas. She talked about herself, her travels, and her belief that life should be lived unapologetically. She made him feel young again, powerful, desired. Their relationship moved quickly from flirtation to obsession. Charles began flying her out for business trips, hiding her under false names in his travel records. He covered her rent for a penthouse downtown and wired her spending money every week. To him, it was a small price for companionship that made him feel alive. Juliet, for her part, played the role perfectly. She never pushed, never seemed clingy. Instead, she let Charles chase her. But behind the soft smiles and affectionate glances was calculation. She knew the affair was only worth something if it became permanent, and she wasn't about to waste her prime years as someone's secret. With each passing week, she turned up the pressure in subtle ways. Casual remarks about how unhappy he seemed, offhand comments about how trapped he must feel. Charles took the bait. Soon, he began complaining about Isabella, portraying himself as a victim of a loveless marriage, held together only by obligation. What Juliet didn't show was her growing frustration with the situation. Being the mistress was glamorous at first, the gifts, the travel, the luxury. But she had no interest in playing second forever. Charles had made promises to leave his wife, to start over, to give her the life she deserved. But the months dragged on, and Isabella's pregnancy became the excuse for delay. Juliet began to fear that the baby would change everything, that Charles would feel too guilty or too trapped to follow through. So she gave him an ultimatum, disguised as a gentle nudge, but loaded with threat. Charles felt cornered, but he also felt infatuated. The idea of a new beginning with Juliet consumed him. He imagined late nights in Monaco, beach houses in the Bahamas, a life unburdened by fatherhood or marriage expectations. Juliet painted this picture for him constantly, offering herself as the reward for his freedom. And so, with all logic buried under lust and fantasy, Charles made the decision. He filed for divorce just weeks before Isabella's due date. Juliet was triumphant. She had done what many tried and failed, made a billionaire walk away from his pregnant wife. She believed she was on the verge of everything she'd ever wanted: wealth, status, and control. She began preparing to step into Isabella's shoes, assuming she'd be introduced to Charles's circle soon, even envisioning herself at future board dinners and red carpet galas. She even contacted a publicist in anticipation of becoming a recognizable figure in New York society. But Charles didn't move as fast as she expected. The divorce filing caused a media frenzy, and the backlash was swift. The public was outraged. Isabella, heavily pregnant and silent, was seen as a victim abandoned at her most vulnerable. Social media lit up with support for her and condemnation of Charles. Investors began to pull back, not wanting their names tied to a man accused of leaving his wife for a younger woman. Some of Charles's closest advisors urged him to keep Juliet out of the public eye, at least for the time being. Juliet didn't like being kept in the shadows again. She had risked everything: her reputation, her career, her time, for this man. Being sidelined after the divorce filing felt like betrayal. She began questioning Charles more often, demanding clarity on his intentions. When he asked for patience, she reminded him of everything she had given up. Her tone changed. No longer the carefree woman who floated through his life like a breeze. She became sharp, assertive, and demanding. Meanwhile, Isabella had disappeared from the public eye, but not from reality. She had given birth to a healthy baby boy and moved into a private estate away from the media. Juliet assumed she was broken, defeated. What she didn't know was that Isabella was doing anything but hiding. She was quietly building a case, collecting documents, tracing financial trails, and preparing to unleash a legal battle that neither she nor Charles saw coming. Juliet's grip on Charles began to loosen as the stress mounted. His business was suffering, his public image was in freefall, and the promise of a fresh start began to feel more like a prison sentence. Juliet noticed the shift. He was less affectionate, more distracted. She started to worry, not just about their relationship, but about her future. She had burned bridges to be with Charles. If this didn't work out, she'd have nothing to fall back on. Her reputation in the event planning world was already tainted by whispers of the affair. In a last-ditch effort to secure her place, Juliet began recording their conversations, just in case. She asked pointed questions, baiting Charles into revealing damaging admissions about his business and personal life. These recordings, she thought, could protect her if things turned ugly. She stored them on a private drive, believing that if Isabella ever came for her, she'd have leverage. But she underestimated how deeply Isabella had already dug into her life. As Juliet prepared for her victory lap, she failed to see that the ground beneath her was slowly crumbling. Every move she made, every deposit Charles wired, every private flight she took, Isabella's legal team was tracking it all. Juliet had started this game with confidence, convinced she could outmaneuver anyone. But what she didn't realize was that while she had focused all her energy on removing Isabella, Isabella had never stopped watching her. And now, the woman she thought she had defeated was preparing to strike back in ways no one expected. The envelope arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, hand-delivered by a courier dressed in black. It bore no return address, only Isabella's name typed in clean, professional font. She sat on the edge of her bed, newborn cradled in one arm, and opened the package with steady hands. Inside were the official divorce papers from Charles Ashford. 10 cold pages that turned 12 years of marriage into a transaction. There was no note, no apology, just signatures and legal terms. Her son shifted softly against her chest, completely unaware that his family had just been severed in writing. Isabella didn't cry. She had already grieved the loss long before the papers arrived. The betrayal had unfolded slowly, like a curtain being drawn back inch by inch, revealing the man she once loved to be someone she no longer recognized. The moment she found that Paris hotel confirmation under Juliet Vaughan's name, she had stopped being a wife and started becoming a strategist. Every action from that point forward had been deliberate. Every smile she gave to Charles when he returned home late, every quiet acceptance of his excuses, had been part of her plan.
She knew she couldn't stop him from leaving, but she could make sure he'd regret the way he did it. While Charles paraded around Manhattan believing he was free, Isabella had been quietly assembling a legal team. Not just a divorce attorney, but
specialists in financial forensics, corporate law, and reputation management. These weren't lawyers who took billboards or gave interviews. These were the types who worked in shadows and charged by the hour what most people made in a week. They combed through every aspect of Charles's empire, from corporate expense accounts to offshore transactions. What they found confirmed what Isabella had suspected. Charles hadn't just betrayed her emotionally, he had also tried to cheat her financially. Over the last year, Charles had quietly funneled tens of millions of dollars out of their shared marital estate into a series of shell companies. One of those companies led directly to Juliet Vaughn. Under the guise of event consulting services, Juliet had received nearly $3 million, money that had been pulled from Charles's private equity accounts and disguised as business expenses. There were also suspicious transfers to a luxury jewelry firm, a boutique in Milan, and a property in the Hamptons purchased under an alias. All of it added up to a pattern of deception. And Isabella had it all documented. She never called Charles to confront him. She knew words were useless. Instead, she filed a countersuit that same week the divorce was finalized. The lawsuit didn't just address the financial misconduct. It accused Charles of breach of fiduciary duty, marital fraud, and emotional cruelty. Her lawyers filed motions to freeze assets, subpoenaed bank records, and requested a full forensic audit of all his companies. In the span of 1 week, Charles went from thinking he had escaped unscathed to watching his legal team scramble to contain the damage. The media caught on quickly. Once the darling of Wall Street, Charles was now being dragged into court by the woman he had left during pregnancy. Headlines exploded. Tabloids picked up the story with ruthless glee, publishing side-by-side photos of a radiant Isabella holding her newborn, and Charles stepping out of a town car with Juliet, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. Public sentiment shifted almost instantly. Isabella became a symbol of strength, praised for her composure and intelligence. Charles, on the other hand, was mocked, criticized, and labeled everything from a fool to a narcissist. Investors began to withdraw. Stock in Ashford Holdings dropped nearly 12% in the first week after the suit went public. Board members started asking questions about Charles's judgment, wondering aloud whether his personal choices were endangering the company. Internal investigations were launched. Some of the shell companies tied to Juliet were flagged by auditors. Rumors of criminal charges began to circulate. Charles tried to fight back. His lawyers attempted to paint Isabella as vindictive, accusing her of dragging out the divorce out of spite. But the facts were impossible to dismiss. The financial records she had preserved, the emails between Charles and his accountants, and the property deeds all pointed to a clear pattern of misappropriation. Even worse, Juliet's name appeared on several contracts, documents she had signed in a rush, never expecting anyone to see them. She had tied herself directly to the money trail. Behind closed doors, Charles and Juliet began to unravel. What had started as a passionate escape turned into a pressure cooker. Charles blamed Juliet for pushing him into a divorce at the worst possible time. Juliet blamed Charles for being careless and weak. The fights became more frequent. Charles, under the mounting stress, began drinking more, showing up late to meetings, and ignoring calls from his legal team. Juliet, fearing that her future was collapsing, became increasingly paranoid. That paranoia wasn't unfounded. Isabella's legal team had uncovered even more, hidden audio recordings made by Juliet herself. In several of them, Charles could be heard talking candidly about moving money to protect it from Isabella, mocking her behind her back, and even admitting that Juliet had manipulated him into filing for divorce. The recordings, once verified, became part of the case. The court saw not only the financial deceit, but the personal malice behind it. When the recordings were played during a closed-door hearing, the judge's tone shifted. What had initially been seen as a bitter divorce case was now being treated like a calculated scheme to defraud and humiliate Isabella. Settlement negotiations were halted. The judge authorized a full trial. Charles's lawyers, realizing the magnitude of the damage, urged him to settle quickly and quietly. But Isabella refused to back down. She wanted everything exposed. In the months that followed, Charles watched his empire crumble piece by piece. Contracts were cancelled, partnerships dissolved. A once-courted billionaire was now a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, Isabella remained composed. She appeared in court dressed in neutral tones, never addressing reporters, always accompanied by her legal team. She didn't need to shout. The evidence spoke for her. Through it all, she never wavered. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was reclaiming what had been stolen from her, not just money, but dignity, trust, and the future Charles had tried to discard so easily. Every document she submitted, every witness she called, every dollar she traced back to Juliet's accounts. Each was a message. She may have been betrayed, but she was not broken. And she was not afraid. Juliet Vaughn had never imagined her world could fall apart so quickly. One moment, she was living in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, sipping champagne while scrolling through luxury catalogs. The next, she was staring at a subpoena with her name on it, realizing that everything she had carefully built was slipping through her fingers. The headlines were merciless. Every news outlet had a version of the story, each more humiliating than the last. She had gone from the glamorous mystery woman on Charles Ashford's arm to a central figure in one of the nastiest divorce scandals the city had ever seen. She tried to maintain her composure, but the walls were closing in. Her name was now attached to fraud allegations. Investigators had begun questioning her former employers, combing through her business transactions, and demanding answers about the lavish gifts and properties linked to her. The designer bags, the European vacations, even the Hamptons house, it all now carried the stink of scandal. Overnight, she went from a social climber to a pariah. Friends stopped returning her calls. Event clients quietly pulled out of contracts. Her reputation was radioactive. Juliet was summoned to court as a witness in Isabella Ashford's lawsuit. She appeared calm, dressed in a sharp black suit, but beneath her polished exterior was a storm of panic. The courtroom was cold and silent as she took the stand. Isabella sat on the opposite side, flanked by her legal team, expression unreadable. Juliet refused to look at her directly. Her attorney had warned her not to say more than necessary, to keep her answers short and controlled. But under cross-examination, her voice wavered. She was asked about the money, why Charles had paid her through shell companies, how she came to own a home without a mortgage, what services she had allegedly provided in exchange for over $3 million. Her responses were vague, inconsistent. When pressed, she admitted she hadn't signed a formal contract for most of the payments. She claimed it was a verbal agreement, that she had provided consulting, but couldn't describe the services in any detail. The courtroom murmured. The judge asked for clarity. Her attorney objected, but the damage was done. Juliet's financial records were displayed on the large courtroom screen for all to see. Line after line of transfers from Charles's accounts, luxury purchases, international wire transfers, and personal gifts. She tried to maintain her poise, but the whispers were deafening. The court saw through the facade. This wasn't a relationship based on business or partnership. It was indulgence, manipulation, and deceit. Behind closed doors, Charles was spiraling. His empire was unraveling faster than he could respond. Board members resigned, stockholders filed lawsuits, and regulators launched their own investigations. What had begun as a personal betrayal was now a financial catastrophe. In an emergency board meeting, Charles was forced to step down as CEO of Ashford Holdings. His legal team negotiated his exit in exchange for immunity from further civil claims by shareholders. His once flawless public image was now tarnished beyond repair. At the same time, Isabella's countersuit gained momentum. The court ruled in her favor on several preliminary motions, granting her access to a portion of Charles's seized assets and ordering a temporary freeze on any accounts linked to Juliet. The judge made it clear that Isabella had a strong case, not just for alimony and child support, but for damages caused by fraud and emotional distress. The public supported her more than ever. She became a symbol of dignity in the face of betrayal, a woman who turned heartbreak into strength. Juliet, now unable to access many of her own funds, scrambled to maintain appearances. She tried to book media interviews, hoping to spin the narrative in her favor, but no outlet was interested in her version. She was labeled a homewrecker, a gold digger, a cautionary tale. Even her social media followers, once loyal admirers of her lifestyle, turned on her. Comments flooded her posts, some mocking, others cruel. Eventually, she deactivated her accounts and withdrew from the public eye. What she hadn't expected was what came next. After the trial revealed the extent of her involvement in Charles's financial deception, she received a letter from the district attorney's office. She was being investigated for conspiracy to commit fraud. While Charles's legal team had managed to protect him from criminal prosecution, for now, Juliet had no such shield. The recordings she had secretly made, intended to protect her, were now being used as evidence against her. Her own voice, coaxing Charles to move money and promising to handle things, was played back to investigators. She had outmaneuvered herself. Meanwhile, Isabella focused on rebuilding. With the court's ruling in her favor, she was awarded primary custody of her son, ownership of 2 Ashford properties, and a significant share of Charles's liquid assets. She also established a trust for her child, ensuring that he would never be financially dependent on his father. Her victory wasn't just personal, it was complete. She emerged from the trial stronger, more respected, and with her integrity intact. She made no public statements. She didn't need to. The court documents, the headlines, and the silence from Charles and Juliet spoke louder than any words could. Charles, stripped of his title and fortune, retreated to a private estate in the countryside. He tried to avoid the press, but photographers found him eventually, older, grayer, and alone. His calls to Juliet went unanswered. She had moved to a small condo outside the city, living off what little she had left. The glamorous life she once flaunted was gone. She applied for work at several firms, but was turned away each time. Her name carried too much baggage. The scandal became a cultural milestone, a warning about arrogance, betrayal, and underestimating the people we hurt. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected every detail. Think pieces debated whether Juliet was a villain or a victim of her own ambition. But the consensus remained clear. Isabella Ashford had won not just the case, but the war. As for Juliet, she faded into obscurity. The woman who once seduced a billionaire and believed she could replace his wife found herself alone, watching the empire she had tried to steal turn to dust. The choices she made for power and wealth had cost her everything: her reputation, her freedom, and her future. And Charles, the man who had traded his family for a fantasy, was left with nothing but regret. The courtroom was quiet as the final judgment was read. A year had passed since the scandal first broke, and now it was ending the same way it began, under the gaze of flashing cameras, sharpened pens, and restless whispers. Isabella Ashford stood calmly as the judge delivered the ruling. Full custody, a multi-million-dollar settlement, permanent control of 2 properties, and an annual trust fund established for her child, paid out of Charles Ashford's remaining estate. What once was a marriage built on love had become a powerful symbol of justice served. Charles did not attend the final hearing. His absence was noted, but not surprising. By then, his name had become a footnote in stories about corporate collapse, betrayal, and reputational ruin. After being forced out of Ashford Holdings, he had quietly sold several remaining assets to cover legal fees, fines, and settlements. His financial advisors, what remained of them, had scrambled to salvage his portfolio, but the damage was irreparable. Charles Ashford, once worth billions, now barely controlled a fraction of his former wealth. The media called it one of the greatest personal downfalls in the business world in recent history. In private, Charles had become a recluse. Living in a rented villa tucked into a remote corner of the countryside, he rarely left the estate. Staff was minimal, and he was rarely seen by neighbors. He avoided newspapers, turned off the television, and refused visitors. The silence he had once craved, after escaping the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood, now felt like punishment. His only companions were the hollow echoes of what could have been. The world had moved on without him, and in its place was a legacy of disgrace. Juliet Vaughan's fall had been even swifter. Following the criminal investigation into her role in the financial misconduct, she was indicted on charges of conspiracy and tax evasion, although her lawyers argued that she had been manipulated and misled. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The secret recordings she had once hoped would protect her only confirmed her involvement. A plea deal was arranged, sparing her prison time in exchange for cooperation and the surrender of assets. Everything she had owned, the jewelry, the properties, the designer goods, was seized or sold. The glamorous life she had once flaunted disappeared entirely. She moved to a small, nondescript apartment far from the city. No one recognized her anymore, and those who did pretended not to. Her name was still whispered occasionally, in scandals and cautionary tales, but her moment in the spotlight had passed. No television appearances, no interviews, no second act. Juliet had gambled everything on the promise of a future with a man who viewed her as a temporary escape, and she had lost it all. Isabella, however, had taken a different path. In the months following the final ruling, she focused on building a new life for herself and her son. With the settlement secured, she didn't retreat into luxury or isolation. Instead, she founded a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting women navigating high-conflict divorces and legal manipulation. The project quickly gained traction, funded in part by the assets she had won in court. She became a quiet figure of inspiration, never seeking attention but receiving it anyway. Interviews were requested, documentaries approached her, and publishers offered book deals. She declined most offers, choosing instead to focus on her son and her mission. The baby Charles had abandoned before he was even born was now walking, speaking, laughing. He would never know the full scope of what happened, not for many years. But in Isabella's eyes, he was the reason she had endured everything, the heartbreak, the humiliation, the legal battles. He had been her strength in silence. And now, he was her reward. The media continued to revisit the story long after the courtroom lights had dimmed. Journalists framed it as a tale of betrayal and justice, of ego and power meeting an unexpected end. Commentators dissected the psychology behind Charles's downfall. Why would a man with so much risk everything for a fleeting affair? Why did he underestimate his wife's intelligence and determination? The answers remained speculative, but the outcome was undeniable. Isabella's legacy became something greater than the marriage she had lost. She was no longer just the betrayed wife of a billionaire. She had become a symbol of dignity in the face of destruction. Without a single public outburst, without resorting to bitterness or theatrics, she had taken back everything that was taken from her, and more. And she had done it while carrying a child, nursing a newborn, and standing alone in the eye of a media storm. Years passed. The scandal slowly faded from headlines. A new generation of tech moguls and celebrities took the public's attention. But those who had lived through it never forgot. Law schools studied the case for its groundbreaking use of financial forensics in divorce law. Advocacy groups cited Isabella's non-profit as a model for supporting vulnerable women. And in quiet, private conversations, many women took strength from her story, proof that walking away wasn't always weakness, and that silence could be more powerful than screaming. As for Charles, his final chapter was written in solitude. He sold his last remaining shares, gave interviews to no one, and was photographed only once more, older, disheveled, standing alone on the deck of his countryside home. The man who once controlled boardrooms and financial empires now looked like someone trying to disappear. In the end, his greatest mistake had not been the affair, the fraud, or even the public humiliation. It was believing that the woman he left behind was powerless. Juliet's story became a whispered warning in elite social circles. How quickly fortune could turn, how charm could not outlast consequence. No one invited her to galas anymore. No one offered her a second chance. She had gambled on the wrong man and discovered that proximity to power did not mean possessing it. And Isabella, quiet, composed, still standing, carried on. She raised her son with grace, surrounded by stability, not extravagance. She gave generously to causes she believed in. And she never spoke of Charles or Juliet publicly, not once. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been written into court records, into financial settlements, into media coverage. Her silence was her closure. The story ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with time quietly setting everything in its rightful place. A woman wronged, a man ruined, a mistress forgotten, and in the center of it all, a child who would grow up never knowing the chaos he had once been born into, only the strength of the mother who carried him through it.